Hello, good morning, afternoon, evening, and nighttime, I'm sure, from wherever you're joining us. What a pleasure to see you once again, just a week after we've had our hybrid learning session on the technology or the technical aspects of what's been going on and what's ahead of us. So we've got another fully loaded panel of experts with us today. And without further ado, let me introduce them to you. We have Sammy. Hello, Sammy. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Wolfgang.
Nice to meet you and, well, finally see you. We've met a little bit before, but this is going to be a fun hour together. Then we have David. Hello, David.
Hey, Wolfie. Good to be here.
Nice to have you join us. And we've got Ollie. Hi, Ollie.
Hi, Wolfgang. It's a pleasure to see you again and really looking forward to our chat this evening.
Yeah, and afterwards, hopefully I'll be invited to your modest home in the background there. And finally, as you all know, we've got Mark with us. Hi, Mark. Welcome back.
Hi, thanks for having me again. Clearly, I must have said something not too bad in the last session to get us to come back to this one as well. So thanks again for having me. Looking forward to, again, a really scintillating and interesting conversation. Thanks.
Yeah, and I think it's also really nice that certainly between the two of us, we've got this continuation between the different episodes as well. I think that's quite important for the viewers as well. So just as a reminder, hopefully you're here because you know what we're going to be talking about. But just as a reminder, we're going to be talking about the more pedagogical side of the hybrid learning theme and topic today. And we've got hence the panelists. They're all from different walks of life, but all from the educative sector, of course. And just like last time, if you can just let us know where you're hailing from, it's really good for us to see where you're tuning in from, who you are, maybe give a little bit of a job title or what you do. And then throughout the show, maybe we'll also be able to go back to that and do ask questions because that's what we're here for. I'll pick them up, or one of our experts will pick them up as we go along. So to kick things off, I think last time around, I sort of defined what I feel hybrid learning is and what it could be. And rather than repeat myself, I thought, Ollie, maybe we can turn to you and talk a little bit about your insights as to sort of the definition of hybrid learning and what you make of it all.
Thanks, Wolfgang. In its sort of simplest form, I understand hybrid learning to be where your class or your learners have a geographical difference amongst them. So that means you might have some that are face-to-face with you in the classroom, while simultaneously at the same time you have a portion of your class, the learners, at a different geographical location, and they're dialing in virtually to join your class, to be a part of that learning sequence with the rest of the learners. So that's as I see it. It's just simply a geographical difference where some of the learners are face-to-face and others are somewhere else, but still dialing in real time to join you.
Yeah, so I guess, I mean, your definition, last time I talked a little bit about that. I feel hybrid learning could actually also happen within the vicinity or the physicality of a school itself, but maybe just not within that same classroom space. Is that something you would agree with?
Yeah, that's actually a position that we found ourselves in the Middle East, kind of rewinding back about 18 months ago, due to social distancing measures across all schools in the Emirates. We had what we referred to at the time as satellite classrooms. So we could only have a capacity of about 10 to 12 students per room. So we would have those students there face to face, whilst we'd have another 5 or 6 in a different classroom, but still in the same school, plus another 5 or 6 students at home on rotation, moving around. So it's as you say, correct and totally possible to have that vicinity situation where they're in the same locus, but sadly can't be in the room with you. Fortunately, the governing body out here decided to move away from that scenario relatively quickly as cases decreased across the Emirates, and we found potential distancing numbers increasing in classrooms, so we could have more learners face to face with the teacher, which was fantastic and a breath of fresh air at the time.
Fantastic, brilliant. So maybe to dive into straight away a little bit into the details of it, Sammy, you work a lot with further education and are well known for your sort of positive uses of EdTech in the hybrid learning and teaching space. You recently had a presentation at the ALT conference. So can you share with our viewers a little bit about what you see as being the key factors of successes in hybrid learning?
Yeah, thank you. I think the first thing is the amazing effort that teachers put in. I think none of this happens by accident. So big up to all the teachers that are trying new things and putting things out there at the moment. The biggest things that make it successful are having the right equipment, being prepared, having things planned. And what I'm seeing is a shift from the traditional 5-minute lesson plan or whatever it's been called wherever you've been teaching to the what equipment do I need in the room? How am I going to structure the layout of the room to best serve the students at home and the students in the classroom? And then what resources can I put in their hands? And I'm a huge fan of anything that's self-marking. Because I think as teachers, where we add our sparkle and add our magic is in those meaningful conversations of understanding why answers are right or wrong, rather than just checking whether they are right or wrong.
Yeah, and I guess, I mean, picking up on that a little bit, I also found at the beginning of all of this, and I wonder how that was in the further education sector, there was a real struggle to try and get that balance right, or try and even decide between synchronous and asynchronous teaching and how and what that should look like. And I mean, between all of you, you must have experienced a little bit of that. How did you maybe within that same question of best approaches, how did your respective places that you associated with or worked for sort of deal with that or decide on how much synchronous, how much asynchronous teaching should be happening?
I'm a huge fan of asynchronous. It has been revolutionary for me in my teaching practice and my presentation that I did at, for the conference. What we found in further education is that if we front load the materials and the students can study at their leisure, then we can do that magic sparkle bit that we do as teachers of developing and deepening that understanding in the live synchronous element. So it then became a blended approach that we followed. I was talking to one of my students this week, because even though I work at Text Help, I still teach in further education on an evening, and one of my students I've never actually met. And they're studying their GCSE maths course fully online using the asynchronous materials, and they don't feel that they need that synchronous element. And I asked for a meeting with them and I said, why is this working for you? What is the difference for you? And what they said was that I feel with my additional complex needs, when I'm in a classroom, I'm under pressure, and this just works for me the way it is. And I think the changes that people have made in their practice, we know our students best, and what we need to try and focus on now is how do all these options that we've tried, how do they best serve the students we have in front of us today?
Yeah, so true. And then that was a major part of our discussion last week, sort of deciding what were the good takeaways, how can we continue going with them, and what were the ones that we maybe need to look at and refine and do better at. And I think this is a natural sort of flow into David, your vast experience of leadership in predominantly international schools, in terms of like you were at the forefront of when all of this hit in a leadership position. You needed to act on your feet. You had a faculty to look after, your students to look after. So what kind of approaches have you taken to ensure, especially that consistency piece, once things started going into online and hybrid and online teaching and learning?
Well, yeah, I mean, to follow on from what Xavi was saying about asynchronous and synchronous, obviously it's slightly different in the different age ranges within the school. Obviously, in primary levels, asynchronous was preferred, whereas in the secondary, it was very much felt that the structure that the students required was best offered by having as much synchronous element as we could, and that was very much appreciated by the parent feedback that we had. But I guess the most important thing in terms of establishing kind of at least a baseline and some kind of consistency was to determine. I think whenever you're faced as an administrator with particularly a challenge that relies heavily upon the IT skills of your teachers, then there's going to be different worries, different concerns out there. And our main aim at the beginning was to establish what are our goals, because obviously we were going to be losing the students in the face-to-face, and so we were moving to home-based learning. In terms of timing, it was similar to one of the points that was raised in the last episode. we'd actually just switched to a different device for all the teachers. And as part of the training for the device at the beginning of the year, we'd actually had some trainers in from Microsoft and had done a full session on Teams. Completely coincidental, but that happened at the beginning of the year. And so then when we were going into it, we had already in place some knowledge. And then we relied quite heavily on kind of the online support and the teaching that the Microsoft Education Center online courses had. And so that differentiation aspect of the teachers in terms of trying to bring everybody up to a baseline was an important aspect of it. And then what we did within our policy or our strategy was to establish minimum expectations, just to ensure that every student would have, for example, if you have a set of lessons, at least one of those lessons should be of a certain structure. We put out kind of like a template in terms of what that one lesson should look like in terms of the amount of, one-to-one time that you had in there, what the kind of like lecture aspect of the lesson was. So we kind of put out those minimum expectations. And then as we went through the process, as I said at the beginning, we ensured that everybody had sufficient PD to get started, but then touch base probably more than we normally would have. I think I had 2 Q&As a week and basically cleared the agenda, just a few items, but basically give people the opportunity to ask the questions that they needed to kind of deal with the issues that they were having. And obviously having people available, our EdTech team were online, myself and the administration were online all the time to kind of pop in and help where it was needed. And so that was really important. But I think the other thing that we did as we moved forward, we kept it really organic. So when people got to a certain level of, I guess, comfort with what they were doing, we kind of cranked up the stakes a little bit and said, okay, we're now 3 weeks in. We should be introducing some kind of online assessment tool. And we looked at what was available and things like that. So it was very much reactionary and kind of like changing, and it was very fluid. I think certainly from my conversations with other administrators, it was a very exciting time for schools in terms of, we've all kind of had times where we're trying to introduce new initiatives in the EdTech field, and sometimes it's kind of it's seen as a tool and there's no real end point or there's no real goal as such, whereas this is a real tangible goal, to be able to offer at least some kind of continuation of education in that kind of very difficult situation was the motivation that where everybody felt that they had to up their game, and you were really kind of guiding people through that process. It was probably one of the most steepest learning curves for so many people, but one that really paid off. And the feedback that we had as we went through it from parents and students was very positive.
Yeah, and I remember like sitting on the sort of admin side of things when we started going into all of this in China, when it all started. And the best thing I think we did as a leadership team, but then also with the faculty, is take that time. We really took it, and I think it was the best part of a week, if I remember correctly, right at the beginning, where we just said, look, we've got to put things on hold for a little bit, and gather our thoughts and do that planning that you've just said in order to discuss those minimum expectations. What does it look like? And additionally, the school I was at, we had 100 different nationalities, and so they went all over the world, and then just simple things like standardized type assessments or tests. How do we collect them in if the time zone is so vastly different? And how do we ensure some sort of things to do with plagiarism and copy and all of those kind of things? Totally shook, I think, beliefs at the core as well to a certain degree, because you really have to rethink. It's like, well, is this that important? Can we do it differently? And so that was really important. And I think I'd be amiss not to show a little bit of what we at i3 also developed in that time, and that's really our interpretation of that virtual classroom. And as you can see from some of the images that are going to come up, this is kind of like using the interactive displays to really make learning in a hybrid sense feel as if you are together still in that classroom. You know, having the visual aspect, the audio, of course, but then also being able to collaborate through LearnHub, our online software, our teaching activity tool and builder, and really looking at ways for us to be able to keep that classroom atmosphere, as you said before, Sammy. That's the power, isn't it? Being in front of students and being with students, being able to read reactions and those kind of things. And I think in my conversations throughout all of this time, that's the one thing that often has gone amiss, is that, well, how, you know, things don't look right, they don't feel right, they don't sound right, and so then you quickly lose that engagement piece. And so Ollie, you know, what do you see as being tenets or hallmarks of good hybrid learning? You know, we've talked a little bit about that logistical piece and that whole setup and planning it. But yeah, what does that look like in learning, and what is good hybrid learning from your experience?
Thanks, Wolfgang. There is actually an infographic, if we could pop that up on the screen. And this is something that nearly 2 years ago, we shared across our school, the British International School of Abu Dhabi. And the point that we really stressed to the educators was that good teaching and learning is still good teaching and learning, regardless of your geographic location. And these were our top 5 tips for educators in our school, and we shared these with parents and with the students. The first one then is, of course, to present information to the students that's new in very small chunks. We know that students are likely going to be cognitively overloaded with everything that's going on around them in you know, their environment. And it's really important then, looking at the research from Rosenshine and cognitive load theory, to make sure that we're advantaging, I think is the best word I can use there, our learners by not overloading their working memory, and providing that new information in really small steps and giving them lots of guided practice to help break down concepts and procedures. And this is backed up from research from the Education Endowment Foundation, alongside you know, Rosenshine's principles of instruction, cognitive load theory, dual coding theory, and so on. So that was our first hybrid learning tip for educators. Our second tip is provide worked examples. I think if you look at the research from, again, the Education Endowment Foundation on metacognition and self-regulated learning, you know, modeling your own thinking to help pupils develop their metacognitive skills is still something that we need to develop, whether we're a face-to-face, hybrid, or blended. And that's down to the educator to decide if that should be done synchronously or asynchronously, because they know their students best. Likely, I would imagine most educators went down the asynchronous route for that, to open up other channels, which I'll talk about a little bit later. But you know, that's hugely important that we still maintain revealing our thought processes as the expert educators and reduce the mental demands on our learners in that hybrid context, so that the students can actually use those worked examples to continue their studying, you know, access teacher thinking, clarify and crystallize steps and concepts in learning, much as you would in a face-to-face environment. Our third top tip was to check for understanding using low-stakes testing. And just as you know, you yourself, Wolfgang, and David has alluded to, you know, the new normal can be challenging enough. And I think it's really important to make sure that we don't increase those demands by providing really high stakes assessments in a hybrid learning environment for, you know, many hopefully obvious reasons. You know, assessment is just a vehicle for obtaining a success rate, I think, in our students. And it's important that we do test the temperature of learning, but how you go about doing that is hugely important, because we want to encourage the students to think aloud in a non-threatening atmosphere without facing kind of grading as such, I think. So it needs to have challenge but lack threat. So how we go about that is really important in identifying, clarity of thinking for students in a really safe space. So it needs to be low threat. And if I can draw on my physicist background, as Stephen Hawking once said, the cost of bad data is the illusion of knowledge. And I think that really sums up the importance of making sure that any kind of testing that you do is really low stakes for the student. Number 4 then is peer and teacher collaboration. I think this is possibly one of the most important of these 5 top tips. We need to continue to foster that sense of community and connection. It's what not only helps motivation, but it helps buy-in, it helps continuation of what normal might have been, or at least that sense of community and collaboration amongst our community, I think is the best word for that. And that's built into the very fabric of us as humans. So to neglect that, I think, is a really large error. Therefore, we need to provide as many opportunities for interactions as possible. And that might mean we take a slightly different approach then to different tasks. But that's not a bad thing. I think we need to have in our core the mindset of making sure that we motivate the students, we can improve outcomes, enable connection, collaboration, and a sense of a classroom environment, whether it be face-to-face, hybrid, or even blended, just that opportunity to connect. And then the 5th top tip, of course, is feedback. The purpose of feedback, I think, if we just draw on that for one moment, is to close the knowledge gap and move learning forwards, and therefore move our understanding forwards. And I think peer feedback in this is hugely essential. It builds on that aspect of collaboration amongst our classroom in whichever simulation you find yourself in, but it also provides the opportunity for the class to come back together again, and for the teacher to connect and collaborate, whether it's with small groups or the whole class, whether it's synchronous or asynchronous. I think it's hugely important. We've seen loads of great things spawn off of that, whether it's Mote and audio feedback that's finally found its fore in education. They're great examples of things that our teachers have done, and I think teachers globally have done, that should be recognised. Good teaching learning is still good teaching learning.
Absolutely, and I love the fact, Ollie, that a lot of your tips there are applicable, as you've alluded to and said quite rightly many times, whether it's hybrid, online, face-to-face. I mean, these are tips just for general good practice and classroom atmosphere, aren't they?
Absolutely, yeah. And I think when the environment initially changes, I think panic might set in for many educators. Think, I have to do things completely differently. You don't. Great teaching and learning is still great teaching and learning. You might just change how you go about the environment and operating in that, rather than being the traditional face-to-face, aspect. But the difference, I think, really is just changing to, thinking of things. How could this work better asynchronously for all of my learners to drive learning forwards? And I think that quite often can be the change that people arguably might be scared of, or as David alluded to, parents might not necessarily want. But I think 2 years down the line, they've realised that is a successful model for the continuation of education.
Yeah, and actually, maybe before we move on, David, I mean that last point is something. Did you see a change in the community, like the parents, the teachers, the students within the time of hybrid teaching? Did things change for the positive?
I think one of the key points, as I said, we were touching base with teachers on a regular basis. But one of the other things is we set up a channel for people to share best practice. And so when people were having a win or having kind of work problem, the amount of kind of support that they were getting from one another and the sharing that was going on was, I mean, we've always had a part of the server or a part of our process where best practice was encouraged, but I've never seen it to this extent. So in terms of the I said before, professional learning of teachers was enormous, and a lot of that was peer-to-peer. In terms of kind of the feedback part that Ollie raised as well, a lot of teachers and a lot of students were reporting that they were getting more attention on either small group or one-to-one. People were setting up small teams, sub-channels of their class, and then dropping from group to group, or pulling a child out and having a kind of a private chat and things like that. So I think people found more time to do that within the much more structured lessons that they were having to put together. And strangely enough, I mean, one of the things which I'll mention later on in terms of some of the concerns going in there, one of the things that improved was overall behavior in class. A lot of students performed well without the distraction of the physical classroom, which was very few people were expecting, but it was a strange kind of byproduct of the situation that we found ourselves in. And the bottom 20% of our students during home-based learning actually raised the average of the scores that they were having. I mean, yes, there were low stake assessments, but when we returned to school, they had shown a significant improvement. So there was a lot of unexpected benefits that came out of the process.
Great. That's really useful to hear, and I mean, great to also hear that I love that positivity, right? Like, because we can get bogged down and say, oh, this happened and it was also awful, but really there is a huge amount of positivity. And I know that, Mark, you worked with a lot of sort of the parent relationship piece, not only from having children yourself, obviously, but you're quite involved in that anyway, in your roles quite often.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Just to echo what David was saying, a lot of the feedback that I got from both teachers and school leaders was that the conversations about learning with parents were happening, not on a weekly or monthly, but on a daily basis. Loads and loads of improved opportunities there. Parent evenings, have been vastly improved by doing those remotely as well. And linking into that, we've got a comment from Richard Brewster in the chat. Actually, can you see that the snow day is now extinct? Quite apt with storm units on its way. But absolutely, the things we've learned, and sorry, Ollie, bringing Richard's question up there has sort of hidden you behind it. But no, the opportunities that we've afforded ourselves through using technology in this kind of a way in a hybrid setting has really, skilled teachers up in such a massive way during the last sort of 24 months or so. I think we might have a question about this later on, but I mentioned that old sort of phrase in our last episode, Wolfgang, about the thing that our children often say in the back of the car when we're traveling places: "Are we nearly there yet?" Well, we felt that around technology for quite some time, despite the fact we've had access to it. When are we going to start seeing the impacts of it? Well, we're starting to now see those impacts. It's been fantastic to see so many teachers improving their levels of sort of competence, cognizance, and confidence with technology. It links into this little infographic here, sort of created around Mandan Action Klein's sort of stages of teacher confidence in the use of technology. No longer would I hope at least that teachers are stuck down there at survival. They've moved up and are starting to see impacts with their teaching and learning with technology, because teachers have really had to skill themselves up. But the thing is about sort of maintaining that momentum, though, isn't it? Because if we don't sustain the work that we've done, if we don't pick up those improvements, and sometimes it's not around teaching and learning, sometimes it's just about efficiencies in workload. It was interesting to see Sammy sharing in a response to somebody in the chat a moment ago about using Mote for asynchronous feedback. Fantastic thing. Using voice feedback. I know Ollie's a big fan of using voice notes in OneNote class notebook, for example. Why spend a long time writing something, typing something, when you could just use your voice? And it's so much more accessible for your learners as well, isn't it? Absolutely brilliant. That's the question that Kurt asked there, that Sammy gave feedback on around Mote. Mote is the plugin Chrome extension you can use to leave audio feedback in Google and across the sort of Google ecosystem. But yeah, absolutely brilliant to see teachers moving forwards and improving their sort of confidence with technology during the past sort of 24 months. How do we, though, I guess a question back to you, Wolfgang, then, do we maintain that momentum? How do we go about doing that? Because, the teachers want to sort of talk often about sort of returning back to normal. And one of the sort of buzzwords during the pandemic was new normal. Well, what's the new normal? How are we going to sustain the momentum that we've gathered? Because if we don't sustain that use of technology, supporting our activities and work in the classroom, it's use it or lose it, isn't it? So what can we do you think?
Yeah, actually, Richard's put another comment up there, and that sort of alludes to that, doesn't it? It sort of goes into what's next: online homework clubs, revision sessions, catch-up online classes, and then of course that question about how do we ensure health, continued positive and good health for teachers to avoid the staff overload. I think, Sammy, I'll actually, before maybe me going on to it, I love the fact that you're answering some of these in secret, but actually come and tell our audience about it. What do you think? Mark asks a really good question here, and so does Richard.
I think staff overload is my biggest fear. I think my fear for a long time was technology not being used correctly, technology being available and nobody engaging with it. I think, like Mark's graphic showed, we've come so far. My fear now is the staff overload, and it's about finding your why. And I talk a lot about how we need to get teachers to find their why, and then students to find their why to use this technology in our approaches. I've got a great friend on Twitter called More Ideas the Merrier, and he says, right tool, right job. And I think if we just frame everything that we do, the right tool for the right job, I think that will help us in framing this, but we need to recognise we are again in uncharted territory as educators, and there is no right answer. There is no what's going to be the new normal, because we're seeking something that perhaps we might never reach. So we need to reflect and know our students best. Ollie's approach with his 5 top tips of hybrid learning, like I've screenshot that graphic's going in the folder. That's the kind of thing that we need, is that good teaching is still good teaching.
Yeah.
Promoting that metacognition, promoting that self-regulation, and preparing our students with the digital skills that they can then transfer no matter what the future brings for them.
No, absolutely. And I keep harping on from the beginning on, when I was involved in, or started getting involved in EdTech, that decisions have to be driven by sound pedagogical objectives, outlooks, plans, and technology really comes last in that conversation about how does it fit in, how does it assist, how does it make things happen that may not be able to be happening without technology. All those kind of questions can be asked, but they can only be asked once you're sure about what you're doing and how you're doing it, from a pedagogical and curriculum and subject knowledge point of view. So coming back to something, the man of Bananaramas, Mark, last week you were talking about the very true statement of it ain't what you do, it's the way that you do it. Continuing on a bit of advice giving, I think it would be great if you could expand a little bit on that. We're all sort of touching on it on the edges, and either more directly or indirectly, but give us a little bit of insight here.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thank you again for the question, Wolfgang. And it's interesting, actually, the bit, I often share that, it ain't what you do, is the way that you do it bit. But interestingly, the next lyric along that it is, and that's what gets results. And so, not like Sammy, very acutely shared, was the thing about not using too many tools. I work with some schools, and they very proudly show me page after page after page after page after page after page of apps on their devices. But how many of those apps are you actually expert in? Find those tools. I've shared it in the chat on YouTube a second ago, and it goes back to the adage I shared last week from Zoe Elder about technology enhancing, not dictating the learning. But what we really want to try and make sure is that don't try and use too many tools. Become absolutely expert in the tools that you have. One of my favorite tools for teaching and learning with technology is the humble presentation tool. And I say presentation tool because it doesn't really matter whether it's Keynote, PowerPoint, or Google Slides, really. And again, that goes back to the whole it ain't what you do, is the way that you do it sort of approach, because it's one of those things that you can use so brilliantly. I was working with a school just this afternoon in Wales, and we were exploring the ways in which we could use Moat, which is what Sammy shared before, as a tool for discussion around key themes and topics. So drop your Moat notes, have a central theme in the middle, and this works, well in English. Around key themes in Macbeth. It worked well in art lessons around approaches to creating artwork by Matisse, so forth and so on. And the students were able to give that verbal feedback, working in a collaborative way, working from a hive mind approach where we can learn from each other, sharing that, collaborating upon it. And the great thing about these things is once you've got these resources, Richard was saying in the chat about teacher overload and all that sort of thing, but within your lessons you're creating great resources for revision club, for all these extra things. Don't reinvent the wheel. If you've got these great resources already and you've done it digitally, then curate it and share it and save it across the platforms you've already got. It's not about working harder, it's about thinking smartly about what you've got. And that's one of the great things that technology can help provide with. Record having, and some of the technology from i3 again can help massively with this, but record those lessons using Teams or whatever you've got, and then those lessons are not only transcribed, but they're available for everyone to watch back on Microsoft Stream. It's not about doing extra work. It's about looking at what you're doing already and really squeezing every sort of possible use you can out of it. So loads and loads to think about, and I will just I'm mindful that I'm talking quite a long time, so I won't talk for too much longer, but I did want to share that infographic that I shared last week as well, because it's a great one to think about if you're a school leader, but it's also really helpful when you're thinking about your approaches as a teacher just in your own classroom. So, applying consistent approaches, making sure you're sort of considering the needs of your learners with synchronous and asynchronous, making sure what you're doing is accessible, making sure that you're, involving parents in that conversation, making sure that there's equity of access, making sure that you're getting the right training and support. Measuring what you do, is really important too, and making sure that children are engaged in that. Carl Hendrick sort of relatively famously said, engagement is a poor proxy for learning. But if your learners aren't engaged and aren't actually present, then, are they going to learn anything? Well, absolutely not. So, bringing all these things together can be really, really helpful. And when you consider them, you can try and avoid some of those things you can see on the right. So, for example, if students don't attend, then they have knowledge gaps. If you don't measure what you're doing, you don't know if you've been successful or not. If you don't engage in your own CPD, you become anxious. If there's no access, if there's a problem around bandwidth, about Wi-Fi, about hardware, then it's inequality. This is from your learners. If you don't support parents, then you don't get support from parents. If you don't make sure what you're doing is accessible, people can't actually read it, learn from it, and engage with it. And if you don't consider the asynchronous or synchronous approaches, then you get again a lack of equality of access. And then if you're not consistent, people are confused. There's just. I remember working with one school back some time ago, and I'm all for teacher autonomy, but it goes back to those pages and pages and pages of apps on your iPad. Students have got a hard enough job learning the core content. You don't want them to be having to learn different tools and different apps and different workflows for every single teacher that they actually get to see across their learning experiences. So again, consistency is super, super important. So yeah, hopefully that's but again, consistent approaches, shared transparency, keeping it low, just like quizzing should be low stakes. The technology we use should be low stakes. And if you're going to be thinking about using technology, another adage that I share regularly is, if it's going to take you longer to prepare for your lesson to use that technology than the lesson itself is going to take, then don't use that technology. If you're so time poor as an educator, why would you want to actually spend more time prepping for the lesson than the lesson itself? It just seems bonkers. So yeah, a few sort of nuggets from my experience both in the classroom and working with schools there for you, Wolfgang.
Yeah, I think that last point, Mark, reminds me of when we did our AD in Cork and Duarte presented or had a workshop for Keynote and how to use Keynote in this magical, amazing way. And what a wonderful time that was learning about it. But the amount of time that takes, it's incredible. And you're right. We've got to be realistic in education. The plates are very full, and there's so much. That's the other thing that I wanted to pick up. From the EdTech director or leadership position that I had, one thing that was very generous of companies was, of course, to release a lot of the tools and softwares and solutions free of charge and really help educators as quick as possible. But of course, the flip side of that was there was just such an overload of overlapping similar type solutions where schools and educators were just at a loss. And I think that's also still a part in the market that isn't very well filled, where advisory, I know there are advisory bodies, but really better placed and larger advisory bodies looking at how they can best decipher all of that for schools and give some sound advice. You know, we have some for car testing, we have some for electrical goods and all these kind of things. But in EdTech, there are some companies who are trying to help with this and some non-for-profits, but that's still something where I feel moving forward, we need a bit more. You talked about consistency, you know, and those kind of things. That's really, I guess, the point that I'm trying to get to with some form of monitoring and advice giving. And I think,
just to follow up on that quickly, if I can, Wolfgang, as well. I as you can see, I sort of call myself the ICT evangelist, and for those who know me, you're not going to meet many people more sort of geeky than me, really. But a healthy dose of skepticism about technology in education is important, I think. So asking a simple question of someone comes to you and says, you can do this amazing thing with technology, or ask a simple question, so what? Just because you can, and you've heard me say this many times, Wolfgang and Ollie and others, but just because you can do something with technology doesn't mean to say that you necessarily should. And so, having that as a bit of a North Star, and there was a phrase that came to me from a teacher I worked with in Abu Dhabi. It wasn't Ollie, it was somebody else. But the way they came back to me with it, they said, so what you're saying then, Mark, really, you wanted us to ask the question, is the juice worth the squeeze? And that's really stuck with me, that conversation, because if it isn't worth the effort, then it isn't worth the effort. And certainly, teaching and learning and technology are too important and expensive to leave to chance. So why would you want to risk it? If it's going to take too much time, it's not going to have the impact, it's not going to raise standards or reduce your workload, those sorts of things. So just to add that on to the end for you there, Wolfgang. Sorry for jumping on. And,
no, fantastic. And I do think
you.
all of that conversation, Sammy, I mean, I want to hear a little bit from you about the engagement piece, because we talk about the usage of it and the fact that there are, as I said, so many different types of tools and solutions out there. But what's your experience with your work with hybrid teaching and engagement?
I think engagement comes down to motivation. So if you're not motivating your students, first off, like Ollie said, good teaching is good teaching. Good engagement is good engagement. If they're not motivated and engaged from the start, then you're going to come up against barriers as you go through. And like Mark's just shared about software overwhelm, if it's not going to add value to your lesson, or students aren't engaged to understand what that value is or the purpose of using that tool, then you're going to really struggle. But I think the thing about engagement for me is, I think there was a big lean towards videoed lessons or live lessons that were recorded. And they've been mentioned a few times through here. But would you have sat for an hour at your desk lecturing in your classroom, is the question I often ask. Because I think we then felt that we had to create massively long videos, and we wouldn't. We would stand, do some input, like Ollie said, break it down, small steps, small input. Then we'd go around the room, we'd circulate, we'd check on progress, and then we'd adjust the task and change the direction. And I think, coming back to what Ollie said, good teaching being good teaching, that is still good teaching. But that's where your engagement comes. Your short chunks need to be short chunks. They need to be short videoed, recorded bits. So my asynchronous material is my teacher talk in very small chunks, followed by a quick low stakes self-marking exercise. And then they reflect on their progress. And then we can direct the lesson based on there. Because mine's asynchronous, mine uses branching logic and going to section based on answer in the form. So I've thought about all the possible scenarios, and I can keep them engaged as they go through by giving them the content that's relevant to them. And I think that's a key point as well, is that as well as all the platforms that came at us, lots of content came at us as well. Like, I could present it this way. I could present it this way. Well, actually, is that what's going to engage them? Is that what they need at this point in the lesson? Or are you just throwing things at them and hoping it sticks? And so thinking about engagement, low stakes quizzing, quick wins, self-marking exercises, ways for students to connect with other people is really engaging. David said, like, he cleared the schedule and everyone just had long chats. And I think we did that, and we need to continue doing that. We need to keep checking in on people. But I think we can also do that by doing, Mark said about presentation software. It's nothing more brilliant than a collaborative slide deck and seeing all the students appear all at once working together. And then you know they're engaged because you know they're working with their friends. So the tasks that we would have normally done just need slight tweaks to fit this hybrid environment, but hold true to what everyone else has said. Good teaching is good teaching, and please don't sit and lecture and feel like you have to sit and lecture. Short chunks, short videos, or short engagements, or put some quizzing in the video. You know, there's many platforms. You've got Edpuzzle, or you can do it in Screencastify, or any other way the way you can put the quiz in the video, or you can go like I did and go make your own GIFs, and my students are loving life learning from GIFs. You know your skill set, but please just keep it short chunks. I think that's the biggest thing I've learned from this.
Yeah, and actually, Sammy, that ties in. I'm going to bring up a comment and concern here by Richard. Actually, that it's something that, of course, has come about with this as well. And you've quite rightly said this sort of the chunking up of learning and the time it takes. And I remember years ago, I did a survey with students about online engagement and time spent, in front of their computer, specifically to do with homework in that case, because there was a real, and I've got to say, a misconception by the parent body that we as the school were forcing students to spend all this time in front of the computer. Now, I totally agree with you, Richard, that hybrid learning is, of course, massively escalated that sort of necessity to a certain degree. But what I definitely found out, and the students were very honest, I've got to say, I coached them into giving proper, honest answers about the time spent. About 70 to 80% was actually spent nothing to do with schoolwork and school engagement. It was to do with Facebook popping up and being up on a different tab, and Twitter being there, and Instagram on their phone, and so I guess it's the same old advice as when it comes to parenting. And of course, as you get into the teenage years, this becomes far more difficult. But really, getting your children to have dedicated time for certain tasks. So hybrid learning, really, if you can dedicate an hour or 2 hours towards that, then really it will become much more efficient. And helping the students control themselves, the sort of urge to go off on different tasks, and concentrating their time to really what is at hand and what needs to be done. Now, again, at the beginning, that wasn't easy because I think schools were requiring a lot of synchronous participation. But I think as we now nearly 2 years on, for some schools, actually 2 years on now, for the school I left, it's been 2 years now. That's got to have changed by now, that schools are much better at that balance between synchronous and asynchronicity. And Sammy said, I mean, I totally agree. I think synchronous has a place in very short spurts and sort of moments, but really there's such great tools that allow you to asynchronously teach in a quality way. So moving on, unless anybody wants to add to this particular point, I'd love to discuss a little bit about social media, as we are being streamed also in social media, about its importance throughout this time. I mean, I found it massively helpful. My inspiration and my help comes from the people on this panel, but also many others, for finding great ideas and approaches that help with hybrid learning. So to all of you, are there any must follows, any sort of top hot tips that you want to put out there for people to get their hands on? Maybe we'll start with you, David. You've been quiet for a while. Have you got something where you go, come on, get on that?
Well, I think you know that the one tool that I've been using most of all in the past couple of years, not social media per se, but it's really been access to podcasts. We rely a lot on books and textbooks that are very static in terms of what they cover. Whereas, I mean, nowadays you can have access to some of the best thinkers in the world, and certainly a lot of the current affairs that are covered in podcasting has changed. Certainly for me, that aspect of if I want the students to read a chapter or a section of a textbook, I probably wouldn't do that anymore. I would seek out a podcast. Certainly when I was teaching theory of knowledge, people like Gladwell and Freakonomics and things like that. But even within the subject specialists, areas. I've recommended podcasts to people. I just find that students prefer that way of accessing the material. It's something they can listen to on the bus. And a lot of the podcasts are very kind of engaging and inspirational in terms of the questions they raise. And it just brings a lot of that material to life. So that, for me, that's been the big game changer in the past couple of years. And it was something that I was using as part of my teaching and learning during the home-based learning as well. And that's been transformative from my perspective. Not quite social media, but similar.
Well, no, not necessarily. I mean, it depends, again, how you define podcasts. I mean, of course, there is a definition for what a podcast is, but I think it's taken many shapes and forms over the last couple of years as well. So the traditional podcast was somebody sitting with a boom mic in a room or studio to all kinds of different ways. Vlogging is that podcasting, so anyway, over to the others. Any must follow bits, nuggets?
I've got one. Anyone that's operating in a Microsoft ecosystem, Mike Tholfsen is a fantastic follow. He's at M Tholfsen on Twitter, and on that kind of podcasty, vloggy theme, he shares videos that are like anything from 10 seconds, like this is how you do this, all the way through to, here's 10 awesome things you can do with this Microsoft tool. And no shame, I've shared some of his videos with not only our staff in our school, but also students, because, in going back to Mark's principle, if there's something already out there that does the job, why not share it? And Mike's videos are absolutely fantastic for kind of all Microsoft products. So give him a follow.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. We were Microsoft school in China, and he's definitely one of my virtual heroes. Never met him, but he's doing a great job for Microsoft. Mark, Sammy, I mean, you guys are media, social media gurus.
I'm trying to hold it in, like the list is really long. But I'm gonna give a shout out to my friend Ryan Evans, and he has a wonderful platform called Include Edu, and I'll pop it in the chat in a moment. And what that is a teacher generated platform where you can search via platform, Microsoft, Google, Apple, and additional learning need that a student may have, and then find other teachers' suggestions of technology that might help with that student with that learning need. So that's a great one to check out.
Fabulous. Thank you, Sammy. That's brilliant. And Mark, you're holding back. This is very unlike you to go last for this, because you've got some nuggets as well.
I've got one or two, but I'm gonna choose someone a bit closer to home, actually, because he does an awful lot of good sharing. And one of the lovely things that I love about this guy is that he's a real amplifier of others. And so whilst he shares a lot himself, he writes in Forbes magazine, he blogs on his own website. He wrote a book relatively recently as well called My Secret EdTech Diary. And now you're all nodding, I'm going to talk about. But Al Kingsley at @AlKingsley_edu is a great follow. He's a very humble gentleman, but he shares tons, and he's great for a number of reasons, in that he bridges both the vendor side of things, because he's the group CEO of a large edtech company that I actually work at as well. But on top of that, he works as part of the Regional School Commissioners Board here in the UK. He's the chair of a large multi-academy trust. He is also governor at a bunch of alternative provision units. He is a big ambassador and supporter of apprentices, and he's all about not just sharing great stuff outwardly, but also uplifting and retweeting and amplifying the things of others. And he supports lots of activities around EdTech. So a great person to follow, and well worth reading his sage advice around all things teaching and learning with technology, from a leadership perspective through to in the class to all sorts, really. So definitely give a shout out to Al.
Agreed. And some great publications to help people get started, keep being grounded, future advice. I think absolutely. Oh, Ollie, you're back on. He's thought of another one.
On that thread, I highly recommend that if you haven't done so already, you go to schooldigitalstrategy.com and read Al and our very own Mark Anderson's Guide to Creating a Digital Strategy in Education document. They are absolutely fantastic, and they ask lots of really salient questions that will get you thinking about your own particular school, its context, your learners, everything involved in it, from the tech team through to the parent community, everything we talked about today. So please do visit schooldigitalstrategy.com and read the digital strategy guide, because it's brilliant.
Good shout out, Ollie. Maybe you can just put that in the comments as well for people to go there. So
Thanks,
just for oh yeah,
I'm just saying thanks. I'm not going to say anymore.
Yeah. Look, I just wanted to briefly, one of the really important things, and it's something that we have to remind ourselves on, as in all of this, we can't forget about the safeguarding element as well, of especially when moving into the digital and virtual domain of things. And David, as a school principal, you know, you've got, again, that firsthand experience of the safeguarding element. And is there any advice that you can briefly put out there? I know that it's a massively long topic for our viewers to follow and listen to.
Yeah, I mean, the main concerns, obviously, when we were going into the home-based learning were surrounding privacy, cyberbullying, and academic honesty. Although, as we went through, kind of mental health became more of a red flag as well. I think what I'd say is that the danger is that you just rely on maybe your acceptable use policy that you have in school, but I think it's broader than that. And so what we did is we looked at all of our existing policies, whether it's academic honesty, behavioral policies, and sat down with our support team that involves the counsellors, psychologists, whatever you have in your school, and have that conversation in terms of, do the existing policies encapsulate hybrid learning? And rather than add to just a list of rules, what we found was we were actually streamlining our policies to basically become more value driven, so that basically, you know, we tied a lot of our policies, particularly in things like behavior, around the ideas of things like respect. And respect in the classroom is very similar to respect in the virtual classroom as well. So in the same way as kind of the basics of teaching and learning should be respected, I think if you've got a sound policy on safeguarding within the school, then it should apply equally. A good safeguarding policy should work in the hybrid environment. It may need some tweaking, but I found that the tweaking was more about really anchoring it within the values that run through your policies, and ensuring that you were explaining that and talking about that in the pastoral engagements that you had both with the students and with the parents, so that everyone's got the same understanding of why the hybrid learning or the virtual learning is not that different from the kind of expectations that you would have within the classroom environment.
Yeah, it's quite interesting, isn't it? Because it also brings up that point in my mind about the concept of digital citizenship. Is there a difference, a real difference between being a good citizen or citizenship program and a digital citizenship program? If you look at things like bullying, online presence, plagiarism, all of those kind of things, are they really that different to the non-digital world? I mean, you're right. I think policies probably should be written in a way where we incorporate the digital element, but we don't specifically talk about that. Sammy, you're going to jump in. I can see it.
I am. I'm just going to give a big shout out to Common Sense Education and their digital curriculum. Yeah. Also, UK lessons now that align to UK law. So if you are in the UK, they're also available in other languages, and they are based in America, but they have redrafted the curriculum for UK law as well. And they're just grab and go, ready to go lessons that cover all these, but they come with parent resources, which I think is really fab.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. They do film ratings for parents. They've got massive parent toolkits. I mean, the number of times I've had parent sessions on that aspect of parenting, and they just didn't know. Common Sense Media is fantastic. And I would also just go a step further and say any educator who really cares about that, getting certified through Common Sense Media, schools taking it up as a certification, I think the more the better and merrier, because they really do a fantastic job. So I'm weary of time. I've got a few more things to say, but before I do, I really just want to put it out there one more time to the panelists in case there's stuff that we've missed that you really feel an urge to still add before we say goodbye to our lovely audience and do the wrap up. Anything from anyone? All right, silence it is. Fantastic. Well, with that, we, as every episode, have got a couple of winners to announce for our giveaway this time round, once again, for the hybrid learning. What better than a full HD camera? And we've got 2 people from not the mainland Europe. We've got Susan from the USA and Helen from the UK. Congratulations, both. You will be contacted by our marketing team. Fantastic. And I'm so excited. Last time I talked about a new release. I know it's a piece of hardware, but it really is a difference in the flat panel and interactive panel world. So we have released our X1. So for more information, scan the QR code. It's a fantastic piece of kit. I think it's very exciting. I've already talked to educators all over the world that have had sneak previews or information, and they are all extremely excited. And with that, it brings me sadly to the end. And I really thank everyone for joining me and us, Sammy, David, Mark, and Ollie. Fantastic to see you guys. Hopefully we can have you on again in the future. And our next episode, for those who are interested, is on special educational needs and disabilities. We'll have some fantastic experts on there again, 17th of March, same time, same place. See you then. Bye-bye. Have a good night, morning, or afternoon.